Okay, so we are at a high point of our morning, or shall we say before lunch. But before we let you go and have your meal, I wanted to introduce our keynote speaker, Peter Walker. Peter has been the director and senior partner at McKinsey until a few months ago, and has gone to China and still does almost every month. And he's passionate about China, has done a lot of business in China, particularly in the area of insurance. And today he will talk about his views on U.S.-China relations. So, Peter, thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Anla. I appreciate the opportunity to be able to talk about the subject that I think is, for me, near and dear, and probably the most fundamental issue facing the globe going forward, which is the long-term relationship between the U.S. and China. My interest in China began with a spiritual journey about 35 years ago. At the age of roughly 35 or 40, I asked the question, who died with a smile? I did a lot of research. Anyway, 2 years later, I discovered Taoism and the Tao Te Ching, and that was it for me in terms of really being passionate about China, where it's been and where it's going. I've had two exposures to China over the years. One is through McKinsey. I led our insurance practice for many years, but frankly, my real passion was more on the side of China. I've made probably 80 trips to China over the course of the last 15 years, dealing with a wide range of executives, government officials, but also just many everyday folks and families that I got to know well. And coming out of that experience, I had a very simple view of China, which is enormous amount of momentum, enormous amount of pride, very strong identity with family, and enormous energy. And all you have to do, as many of you have, is just when you go to Beijing or Shanghai or Shenzhen, just look around, and it's kind of breathtaking how quickly it's moved. So that was kind of the one angle in, which was firsthand experience working with people over a long period of time. The other exposure is I love to read, so I read everything I could find about China, the books, the press, obviously mostly the Western press. That painted a very different picture of China that I didn't recognize. What I read was authoritarian, harsh, no human rights, people are unhappy, no rule of law. And then I looked at the more recent books, Death by China, written by today President Trump's advisor on China, which basically talks about trade with China as being the undoing of the U.S., the coming collapse of China, the coming war with China, and the Thucydides trap that inevitably U.S. number one, China number two will have to clash. It's written in history. So I puzzled a lot and said, how could that picture be so totally different from what I experienced over the last 15 plus years? And then I had the good fortune to read a book that I enjoyed very much, and that was On China by Kissinger. And Kissinger made a very interesting point. He said for the U.S. and China to really understand each other fundamentally, there has to be a deep understanding on both sides of historical and cultural context of the evolution of both countries. So I did just step back and say, okay, if someone asked me to describe the United States, what would you say? You'd say individualistic. You'd say minimalist government. Certainly that was the original design. Because if you look at the history of the United States, you're talking about, on average, lower middle class people escaping Europe because of the class distinctions. They did not have economic opportunities, and they did not have personal freedoms. So when the Constitution and Bill of Rights were first put together, the idea was, let's minimize the role of the government. How do you do that? You create a balance of power so the executive branch can never be stronger than the legislative or the judicial. You prescribe the powers that the federal government has, and anything not prescribed goes to the state or to the private sector. And then you have regular elections so the will of the people can always be expressed. So that was the nature of the model. What is the Chinese model? The Chinese model is collectivism, not individualism. It's all about the collective unit, whether it's the family or whether it's society. It's not about me. It's about a strong central government with a single-minded role over time of how do you deliver the most value and raise the standard of living of the Chinese people. And that model's been tested over thousands of years, and we all know that the dynasties change whenever they lost the support of the people. And that model continued until the downfall of the Qing dynasty in 1911. We then went through a period of warlords and a civil war. But coming out of it, starting in 1949 with the Communist Party, that model was reestablished. So if you think about it, the design of the models have evolved very naturally from history and culture, and frankly, it's hard to imagine them evolving in a very different way than they have. But what's very significant to me is both models have been highly successful against their objective functions. So if you look at the U.S. model, what was the objective? It was to unleash American ingenuity and the economic power of people who were very bright, ambitious, and practical, and keep the government out of their way. And certainly, if you look at the performance of the U.S. economy, many centuries later, you'd have to say grade A in terms of the absolute performance over a long period of time. And if you look at a second objective, maximum freedoms, you'd have to give the U.S. very high marks on that. If you look at the China model, and if the objective function of the government has been to serve the people, nowhere else in the world has a country ever delivered 700 million people out of poverty and done it in a way where it has a higher rating of support of the people than any other major country. So you look at these two models and you say, what's the tension all about? They both work extremely well. They're very different, but they're different for very understandable reasons. So what I then wanted to do was to really just step back and say, let's peel back the onion and look at the drivers of the models and see if that shed light on why these differences exist. So the first is the role of the government. The U.S. model was clearly a minimalist model. The idea was that it should keep out of the way of private enterprise, a capitalistic system, capitalize on the ingenuity, and we will have an economy. We as a government don't shape where it goes, but we have confidence that individual entrepreneurs and innovation will take it to the right place. If you look at the role of the government in China, it's the opposite of minimalist. The scope of the government in China has always been anything that is important to our objective function of raising the quality of life for our people. So if we need to expand that to new areas, we will do it. But basically, we're in control, and obviously, it's a one-party system. So the role of government, as originally designed, totally different. If you step back from the role of the government and ask, how does the economy work? The U.S. model was very simple. It was, we've got enormous natural resources. We have no enemies on our boundaries. We have very gutsy entrepreneurial people who escaped Europe and took enormous risks to do it. Let's just let them do their thing. Let's let the market dictate the growth of the economy. And that model's been very successful. The Chinese model is very different. The Chinese model is the government itself will understand where markets are going, where technologies are going, and figure out what the priorities are based on what they read from the people, which they survey very regularly, and then will make bets and allocate resources in a way that will produce the best outcome. Two very different models in terms of approaches, but when you think about it, on the economic front, both very successful. If you look at another area that's highly contentious, which is human rights, again, you have a very different model. So in the U.S., where you had no natural enemies, great natural resources, and escaping oppression and lack of rights in Europe, the U.S. has taken an absolutist approach to human rights, which means inalienable, non-negotiable. China has obviously a very different history. So if you look at what the Chinese people have lived through over the last century, you have the invasion in World War II of the Japanese and inflicted enormous pain on the Chinese people. You have a civil war that cost tens of millions of people their lives. You have under Mao the Great Leap Forward, where we saw tens of millions of people die of starvation because of the not very smart attempt to double the steel output in a short period of time till the farmers start farming. And then you had the Cultural Revolution, which is a very retching and painful experience that basically shut down colleges and tore families apart. So if you ask an average person, where do you put human rights on your hierarchy of needs? They say first food, second shelter, third safety, and then human rights. So not an absolute approach to human rights, a relativist approach to human rights. And yet, despite that, and this is not often recognized in the U.S., China has made enormous progress on human rights. So if you go back to the hukou system, where you were basically told you will live in this village, in this apartment, this will be your job, and this is how you will be paid. And think about where China is today, and the hukou system still exists, but in a much more narrowly defined way. It's really used to basically allocate public resources for health and education to migrants who are moving into the large cities. But the degrees of freedom have been enormous in terms of the increase. If you then ask the question, how do you think about individualism versus collectivism? The U.S. individualism does come from the idea that the original settlers were basically oppressed by government. So providing maximum economic opportunity, regardless of class, and human rights was the name of the game. And so individualism was always the definition of success. Were you individually able to achieve what you wanted to be able to do? The Chinese model has always been collectivist. So you go back to Confucianism, and the family comes first, not the individual. Society is very important. Respect for the government, which is serving the people, very important. So you say, well, what are the implications of individualism versus collectivism? They're very important. So if you talk to Chinese about dissidence and how the government thinks about dissidence, the people in China will say, the government is serving us. If the goal of dissidence is to undermine the government, that's not a good thing. You talk to someone in the United States about dissidents, and the answer is they should have the right to say whatever they want to say. It's not a right or wrong, it's just a very different view. If you look at the subject of the one-child policy, most people in the U.S. are appalled by the concept that the government would tell you how many children you can have. But if you're a collectivist society and your population is growing faster than the food sources, would you just let that continue and let millions of people die of starvation? No, you'd intervene, and that's exactly what was done. If you look at another good example, guns. Holding guns in the U.S. is a right, and because of the National Rifle Association, has been extended to extremes, to the point where in the U.S., 40% of all the privately owned guns are in the U.S., even though it represents a very small percent of the world's population. China looks at guns in a very practical way. It says, what happens when lots of people have guns? Lots of people die of gunshot wounds. 30,000 deaths a year from gunshot wounds in the United States. China, bad idea. Guns aren't going to be allowed. And look at pollution in electric cars. The government is coming out and saying pollution is a major problem. Automobile emissions are a huge part of the problem. We are going to systematically move towards electric cars as the dominant form of transportation over time. The president of General Motors goes to Shanghai and gives a speech and basically says it's everyone's individual right to drive whatever car they want. Okay? Totally different view of the world. So again, I'm not saying that individualism or collectivism, but it does create a mindset difference that is huge. If you look at the issue of democracy, and I know in my early discussions with government officials, I made the mistake of saying, well, you don't really have democracy in China. And I was told, we have a different definition of democracy. Your definition of democracy is an elected democracy to express the will of the people. Our definition is a government responsive to the needs of people. So the Chinese go to great lengths to constantly survey people and identify what the priorities are and where the resources ought to go. And the U.S. is struggling in terms of elected democracy because if you think about the electoral system, the only peoples whose votes actually matter in presidential elections are those who live in swing states, which are about 6 states that account for less than 30% of the total population. I live in New York. How I vote doesn't matter. New York is going to be a blue state forever. That's not going to change. And if you look at the gerrymandering that also happens in the United States, you have the party in power able to basically draw the boundaries any way they want to their own advantage. And the other fundamental problem is only 40% of the people at most vote among those who are eligible. So again, the definition of democracy, even though I think most people have a very simple black and white view, yes, it exists in the US, no, it doesn't exist in China, isn't really the model. So let me touch on perhaps one of the most important differences between the US, and again, this is absolutely not a right or a wrong, but in the U.S. model, the best and the brightest do not aspire to government service. The best and the brightest in the U.S. go into business because it enables them to be entrepreneurs, to be able to grow businesses, enable them to have power, and enable them to accumulate wealth. And that was very much by design in the beginning. If you look at the Chinese model, the best and the brightest, going back to the examination system of 1,000 years ago, always aspired to government service. So you start with a very different pool of people. Now, many in the U.S. would say, and there's no argument, I don't think, against them, that if you have the best and the brightest going into business, they will build a very vibrant and healthy economy, and that will take care of the country. So again, I'm not at all implying that the best and the brightest should go in the government service, but it's a very different mindset and it produces a very different outcome. Now, one of the things you don't often hear when people talk about the Chinese government is the issue of competence. But I can tell you, having spent a great deal of time in business in the US and in China, and having spent a lot of time with government people, the education, the breadth of experience, and the seasoning that the senior people in the government have is extraordinarily impressive. And when I talked to them, I remember talking with the regulator, and we had a meeting scheduled. He said, well, Pete, I'm not going to be able to meet you next week because I'm going to the party school. And I'm saying, well, what do you do at a party school? He said, well, this week we're going to be studying the role of derivatives in financial markets. And this was something that was taken very seriously. So the notion of government officials being very highly educated and very tuned in on key subjects is a very different model between the U.S. and China. And I would say one of the reasons that I'm very optimistic about China's future is the fact that that talent edge at the government level just produces very sound, thoughtful policy decisions over time that, going back to Deng, are very practical and very well thought out. So let me touch on two different angles I think are also important. One of the shaping events in the U.S. obviously was the Industrial Revolution. Our Industrial Revolution ran from roughly 1850 to 1900. There were 5 byproducts of the Industrial Revolution that were created real negative consequences in the U.S. One, very rapid wealth accumulation and with it corruption. Number two, enormous wealth disparity. Number three, oppression of workers. Number four, pollution. And number five, theft of intellectual property. And I was very interested to read a book on the Industrial Revolution in the U.S. where U.S. spies were sent to the U.K. to basically come back with all of their secrets because they were more advanced in terms of technology. What does the U.S. criticize China for today? For corruption, income inequality, pollution, and theft of intellectual property. The reality is, when I looked at this book I read on the Industrial Revolution in the U.S., they had a picture of New York City. You couldn't see across the street. It was no different than Beijing today. So I think understanding the historical context, which Kissinger pointed out, is extremely important. China began its Industrial Revolution with Deng in 1980. And so China's 38 years into it. The U.S., when this book was describing, was at the same point in its Industrial Revolution. The pattern's exactly the same. And the other one is military. Militaristically, the United States has been far more aggressive than China has by any factual assessment. So in the U.S., after defensive wars, the Revolutionary War and the War of 1812, the U.S. became aggressive. And with the Monroe Doctrine in 1823, the U.S. declared anyone who wants to do anything in the Western Hemisphere will have to clear it with us. Teddy Roosevelt, at the end of the 19th century, basically applied that same concept to the Pacific. And the U.S. basically took over Hawaii and Guam and Samoa and the Philippines. So when we think about China, China has basically had three minor events over the course of 1,000 years, two brief invasions of Vietnam and one of Korea. But basically, it's been on the defensive 95% of the time from Mongolians, Manchurians, the Russians, and the Japanese. And the islands in the South China Sea, against that sweep of history, very inconsequential. So in wrapping up, my goal really going forward, I see an enormous upside for everybody if the U.S. and China can cooperate on global issues of environment, of nuclear proliferation, of refugees. And when you think about the history and the context, going back to Kissinger, what's the reason that shouldn't happen? These are not militaristic countries. Certainly China is not at all. And I don't believe the U.S. would be, because it's not in anyone's interest. So I think the first thing that has to happen vis-a-vis the U.S., and I know you're getting hungry, so this will be my final minute. There are three mindsets in the U.S. I wouldn't even say we just need to get the education process out there. I think we need to just open U.S. minds to suspend some beliefs. There are three beliefs in the U.S. that are fundamental barriers to understanding China. One is that an electoral democracy and human rights, first of all, electoral democracy is the only legitimate form of government. And I think you just have to look at the Chinese model and not say it's better or worse. It's different, but it's very functional and it's delivering for the people. And the second is human rights are absolute, and we need to see them now. And that just isn't realistic, and from the point of view of the Chinese people, it's not responsive to what they're looking for. So barrier number one is being open to those two non-negotiables and suspend belief and look at both sides. The second one is to believe that the intent of the leaders in China is to do good for people. Many of the books I've read challenge the basic objective function of the Chinese Communist Party and say the goal is really to preserve their position. And as someone who spent 46 years in business at McKinsey, I can tell you that when you look at what Deng set off and what China has accomplished, The idea that happened with a few leaders in a top-down model has nothing to do with reality. That would never have happened without hundreds of millions of people committing hearts and minds to following the leaders and delivering what it took. So I start out with the idea, having spent a lot of time with senior people in China, that their commitment to the people is on question. And frankly, I think that's true in the U.S. There are many different politicians who have very different styles and points of view, but I don't question their motives. And then finally, there are some things on the China side. I think if China could move from drop communists from Chinese Communist Party and increasingly talk about a socialist country with Chinese characteristics, you would then drop the link to Russia, which is militaristic, has never supported their people, and that would be a huge step forward. And then the final one for China is you have a very successful growing economy. You have more support for your people than any other major country. Why act insecure with your own people? The level of surveillance and the level of insecurity, when the U.S. looks at it, people say, what are they hiding? And the answer is, I don't think there is anything to hide. But it sends a signal that undoes an awful lot of the good that China has to do. So that would be my dream going forward, is that the U.S. and China really understand contextual history and culture, accept both sides, and if those two countries got together to tackle pollution, nuclear proliferation, et cetera, the world would be a much better place. Okay, thank you.